Students, in the last lecture we have discussed about the community, and today we will discuss about the succession and patterns of in a community. Communities are not static, they change. This change can be understood on several levels. The simplest is the growth, interaction and death of the individual organisms as they pass through their life cycles, affected by the cycles of seasons and other natural phenomena. But there are other levels of community change that act over longer time spans and that account for much larger changes in the community composition and structure. These include ecological succession, the reaction of the communities to the alterations is fundamental regional abiotic factor and community evolution. Now let's discuss the patterns of community structure. The replacement of one community by other kinds of communities in course of time due to changes in physical conditions is called ecological succession or ecosystem development. The ecological succession extends over a long time and is gradual and continuous process which continues until a stable community called climax community is reached. The entire sequence of communities characteristics of a given region is termed as a series, and the individual transitional communities are called the serial stages or the serial communities. Series are sometimes classified according to the predominant force that is bringing them about. These forces are biotic, climatic, physiographic and geologic, and their resultant series are commonly called the biospheres, glaciers, ecospheres and the gasospheres. Further, there exist two major types of the successional patterns, the primary succession and the secondary succession. When succession starts from a barren area such as bare rock or open water, it is called the primary succession, as you can see in the picture. But if an advanced successional stage retrogresses or is destroyed, the recovering successive stage leading towards a climax community represents the secondary succession. The general theory underlying the concept of ecological succession defines a successional series from the pioneer stage to the climax as a zero sphere. If it starts from the bare rock or soil or as hydrosphere, if it begins from open water. Varying numbers of serial stages are formed and the relatively stable stage below the climax represents a subclimax. Further, in the successive serial stages, there is not only a change in the species of the organisms present, but an increase in the number of species and in the total biomass. When in an area of forest, a farm field is abandoned, a series of plant communities grow up and replace one another, first annual weeds, then perennial weeds and grasses, and then shrubs and trees, until a forest ends up the development. If a landslide exposes a surface of rock in the mountains, the surface may be successively occupied by sparse cover of lichens, a spreading moss mat, grasses which enter and become a meadow, a shrub thicket which overtops and suppresses the grasses. A first forest stage of smaller trees which seed into the shrub thicket, grow through it and replace it. And a final stage of larger trees which take dominance from the first trees and may form a larger and potential permanent forest community. All these processes of community development represent the simple cases of ecological succession. According to Whitaker, most ecological successions involve many characteristics like there is usually progressive development of the soil with increasing organic content and increasing differentiation of layers or horizons towards the mature soil of the final community. The height, massiveness and differentiation into strata of the plant community increases. Productivity, the rate of formation of organic matter per unit area in the community increases with increasing development of the soil and of the community structure and increasing utilization by the community of the environmental resources. As height and density of above ground plant covers increases, the microclimate within the community is increasing, determined by the characteristics of the community itself. Species diversity increases from the simple communities of the early succession to the richer communities of late succession. Populations rise and fall and replace one another along the time gradient in a manner much like that in a stable communities along environmental gradients. The rate of this replacement in many cases slows through the course of succession as smaller and shorter lived species are replaced by larger and longer lived ones. Relative stability of the communities consequently increases. Early stages are in some cases of instability with populations rapidly replacing one another. The final community is usually stable, dominated by longer lived plants which maintain their populations with community composition no longer changing the directionally. Further, while primary succession is a long term phenomenon, secondary succession occurs quickly and proceeds rapidly. In the process of succession, the first community or the organism to become established are called the pioneer communities. The successful species of a serial stage of succession often modify the environment, resulting in a situation wherein later successional species can stand up to the rigors of the competition. For example, changes in the communities of birds are regulated by the structure of vegetation, availability of perching sites, canopy heights and structure, etc. By developing vegetation cover, modification of environment comes into effect and actively patterns of mosquitoes in different types of vegetation have been known considerably. In forest communities, there exist post-sunset and pre-sunset peaks of activity not met within those living in banana plantations where the periodicity was much less marked. Then community equilibrium and species diversity. The community that ends a succession is termed a climax community. The nature of the climax has been the subject of considerable debate. At one time, it was believed that if an area were given sufficient time, all ecosystems would show succession to a single climax type controlled by the regional climate, regardless of the original space upon which the ecological succession started or the composition of any of the intermediate stages. Acceptance of the doctrine of regional or climatic climax as the normal end point of the succession is due largely to the work of Clements, and a large terminology grew up to describe those stable communities that evidently represented the end points of succession but that were not climatic climax. However, ecological succession is non-deterministic. It proceeds by the dynamic interaction of the natural selection and the progressive changes in available niches without consideration of a goal. Depending on the current state of the ecosystem, there may be several different paths by which succession can proceed at any time in a given area. Thus, the species that can be incorporated into a developing community may be quite varied and may depend on chance as well as the array of environmental factors. It is difficult or impossible to predict the composition of the community in a given ecosystem at some time in the future, even if we can compare it with the pattern of succession in a similar ecosystem. Even slight differences in environmental conditions at some time during succession may lead to the establishment of different communities. If these communities differences are reflected in different sorts of community environment interactions, there may be a divergence in succession so that the climaxes are dissimilar even though the regional climate is the same. Soil erosion and fire are the mechanisms by which community differences can result in the establishment of different climaxes under a single climatic design. According to Whitaker, central phenomenon of the concept of climax is the community's relative stability. The populations of a climax community show some irregular fluctuations in time because of environmental changes and the character of population process, and some climaxes show more regular or cyclic fluctuations. In the climax, however, there are fluctuations around a stable, relatively constant mean condition. Stability of the climax entails balances maintained in the function of a dynamic living system. For a species population in a climax community to be stable, there must be a balance between natality and mortality, between income of new individuals by reproduction and outgo of individuals by death. There are characteristics of climax community. There are mature communities in the climax community. There is high occurrence of vegetation patches and it contains the large plants. The species diversity is high and there is efficient nutrient cycle and the community is well established. Many specialized niches are present, biomass is high and there is low immigration rate and there is efficient use of the energy. These are some of the characteristics of a climax community. Now let us discuss the evolution of the communities. Like the response of the communities to changing abiotic conditions, community evolution involves progressive changes in the climax communities. Because the evolution is exceedingly slow, it cannot be observed in operation and few instances from the fossil record are sufficiently complete to show the process in action. The example that best demonstrates evolution of the basic structure of the community is that of the development of a terrestrial community of a modern type by early reptiles some 250 million years ago. Between the time when vertebrates first became able to lead a predominant terrestrial existence some 350 million years ago and the establishment of an essentially modern type food web some 100 million years later, the structure of the terrestrial community was different from what it is now. Development of the modern type of community structure requires not only a complete rearrangement of the niche structure of the community but also the evolution of new species that could fill the new niches. Attainment of the adaptations needed for terrestrial life by the first amphibians did not know in itself establish a land-based vertebrate community. These early amphibians were carnivores and the only animals inhabiting the land environment were insects. It is inconceivable that the clumsy locomotor system of early amphibians would have allowed them to prey effectively on animals such as insects. Thus, the first communities inhabited by terrestrial vertebrates are best regarded as extensions of the aquatic communities, with the land habit as an adaptation to improve the capabilities of organisms whose prime food supply was aquatic invertebrates and fish. By some 300 million years ago, reptiles had evolved that could feed effectively on terrestrial invertebrates. An entirely land based community was theoretically possible, in which all herbivore niches were assumed by invertebrates and some of the carnivore niches by the vertebrates. However, the paleoecological evidences suggest that most contemporary carnivorous vertebrates were unstable as yet to realize an entirely terrestrial carnivore niche, so that the great majority of the energy flow through the community continued to pass through the aquatic route. The typical food chain to the highest terrestrial vertebrate carnivore was plant and then aquatic invertebrates, then again aquatic invertebrates, feeding vertebrates, semi-aquatic predators and then terrestrial predators. By 250 million years ago, terrestrial herbivorous vertebrates had evolved and a fully terrestrial vertebrate community could come into being. From this time onward, the basic structure of the terrestrial community was of an essentially modern sort, with all consumer trophic levels occupied by a wide range of animals, both vertebrate and invertebrates. Such evolutionary changes in the structure of the communities are caused by a large number of factors. One factor is changes in the regional climate. It was becoming progressively drier during the period under consideration, and the development of a land-based community reasonable response to this sort of change. Indeed, many evolutionary changes in community structure can be explained on the basis of the responses of major changes in the regional abiotic factors to the environment, but other chief factors of the evolutionary changes in community include reorganization of the community structure in response to the realization of niches that had not previously existed in the community. Hope you have got all the concept about the community in the 2 lectures I have provided to you on the community. In the next lecture, we will deal with another topic of the syllabus.